Today's episode is going to walk you through how to get started in computer science education, whether you're a district or an individual. Before I dive into that, I'm going to first explain what I see as a problem in professional development, discuss why I'm qualified to talk about this process, and why I'm doing this for the low price of just asking for you to share the free content that I create. And if you prefer to just jump straight to the framework that I'm providing, then you can use the timestamps in the description to do so. So what's the problem that I hope to address in this particular episode? CS educators are being asked to teach a subject area where they could very easily double, triple, or even quadruple their income compared to being a teacher. They just simply leave the classroom and go into industry using the exact same concepts and practices that they are teaching in the class. They can make significantly more income. With the extreme discrepancy in pay like this, coupled with all the pressures and demands being put onto educators lately, coupled with the relatively new CS mandates across many different states in the United States, all of these things combined have kind of exacerbated the shortage of computer science educators in classrooms in the United States. So to fill this gap, many districts are turning toward professional development providers to help prepare both certified or classified employees to teach computer science in their schools. Most of these educators do not have a background in computer science. Now, these PD opportunities that districts sign up for often cost tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on the size of the district. And if it's not a district that's signing up for it, it's individual educators who, again, get relatively low pay, who are being asked to fork out hundreds, if not thousands of dollars to attend professional development on their own dime. Now, there are some free opportunities for professional development, but these often come with some kind of a catch. The catch might be something as simple as, hey, we're going to provide this free professional development, but if you want to use the platform we teach you on with your students, you actually have to pay per student. So in other words, we're going to train you on this very specific platform, and then in order to actually use that platform, you actually have to pay for it. Now that's a pretty obvious catch that's right there. Now on the other end of the continuum, where you're getting free professional development and free curricula, there are some less obvious catches there in terms of like corporate influence. While corporate sponsors often mean well, there is no such thing as a free lunch. For example, in other episodes, I've mentioned that curriculum providers have had some funders asked to remove some equity-related lesson plans because the funders disagreed with the focus of that particular lesson. And depending on the size of the organization and the amount of funding, this could literally mean several $1,000,000. So this often leads professional development organizations to do what's best for keeping their lights on rather than doing what's best for students and teachers. Or to be completely candid, even making decisions that I would consider to be unethical. Now, I've talked about this in other publications and podcasts, such as episode 134, which is titled Reconceptualizing Music Making, Music Technology and Freedom in the Age of Neoliberalism. Now, even though that episode mentions music in there, I specifically talk about the corporate influence in education at large and in computer science education in particular. So if you want to hear more about that, you can listen to that particular episode. So while salespeople may promise you the moon, the PD itself will often underperform in the long run because it doesn't provide a sustainable solution that actually focuses on what's best for the students and for the teachers. So for example, if a PD is training individual educators, what happens if that individual educator leaves the district? Will computer science continue? If so, how? Especially if they're the only ones who know anything about computer science content knowledge. Now, if an individual or district decides to learn from an individual educator, they are often incentivized to make some generic, mass-produced content rather than bespoke content because it takes significantly less time to prepare for and deliver the same content to different districts and audiences than to create custom-made content for every single individual or district they are working with. In addition, many content creators who create ad-supported content, such as like YouTube content creators, typically cater the content towards CS professionals rather than CS educators, because there's a bigger demand from an audience who is more able to support that content creator through sources like Patreon, merchandise, courses, etc. Now, when the content is actually designed for computer science educators, it's the kind of content that you'd get from attending a 100-level course on CS education rather than a deep dive into a topic at like the graduate level. Now, I say all this with confidence because I have a background that includes personally designing computer science curricula that is used by thousands of teachers and hundreds of thousands of students around the world. I also led the development of more than 50 hours of professional development that had received several $1,000,000 of funding from districts and partners. I have a background working with every single grade, kindergarten through doctoral students, received multiple international awards as both a teacher and a scholar, have presented over 100 times, have over a dozen publications, blah, 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 blah. You can check out my CV on my website if that kind of stuff interests you. I'm just saying this for some context so you know that I actually have some experience in this and know what I'm talking about. At least I think so. But I tell you all this to say that all three of my degrees are in music education. So it's not computer computer science or computer science education. So I've had to learn computer science concept, practices, skills, pedagogies, etc. outside of any degree program. And today's episode is going to help you do the exact same thing for free. Now you might be wondering, okay, if I'm so fancy-pantsy, why am I giving away this information for free instead of charging for it, like creating a course or something? I don't know about you, but I didn't go into education for the money. I did it because it literally saved my life. I wanted to spend the majority of my life helping other people rather than just focusing on making money. That's why I've been sharing free content on my website since 2003. Over the past several months since I decided to go full-time as an independent content creator, I've actively turned down teaching positions in K-12 schools and universities because creating content online allows me to have a broader reach and a wider impact than face-to-face teaching ever can. For example, a single video on like TikTok or YouTube or something could reach millions of people, and it's not limited by geography or time zones, etc. Nor does somebody actually have to pay for that content like you would for like a degree program. I've also turned down other positions as a content creator for computer science curriculum and professional development because, again, I want to do what's best for teachers and students, not what is best for an organization. Long story short, I'm here to help teachers and students, and I want to do this at no cost to you. The only thing that I ask is that you simply share the free content that I create. And I do create a lot of it. A bunch of computer science stuff, a bunch of gaming stuff, and a bunch of drumming content on my website, all neatly organized. If you're new to this podcast, I can confidently say that the more than 116 hours of podcast episodes that I've created have more depth than most professional development and graduate courses you can take on computer science education. As the vast majority of time in professional development is actually spent just walking through lesson plans as a student, which is something that I actually encourage you to do on your own for free. Speaking of something you can do on your own, let's actually talk about how this is 100% something you can do on your own. Whether you're a district or an individual educator, you can learn computer science concepts and practices, and you can also learn how to teach it. I say this with confidence because there are thousands of teachers and hundreds of thousands of students who have learned how to teach computer science with the content that I've created, not to mention all the content that I haven't created that other fantastic organizations have made. Like if you listen to the interviews on this podcast, most of the guests have a background in something other than computer science. It might be like music or physical education or English language arts, mathematics, science, etc. So if a kindergartner can learn how to code, you too can learn how to code and teach coding or computer science at large. So let's actually get into how you would do that. So the first thing that I would recommend is to start by setting a vision. So some questions you might consider are things like, what are your goals for implementing computer science? Are you going to do it in your class? Are you going to do it in your school, in your district? Will you treat coding or computer science as a literacy, or are you just trying to hit the standards without taking away time from other subject areas? What do you want your students to be able to know and do when they leave the program? And what rationales do you align with on the CS Visions framework? Now, in the show notes for this podcast, there are several different steps in here for this particular framework. So if you go to the setting a vision step, there is a section for podcasts and a section for resources. If you click on either of them, it will expand it and show you all the podcasts and resources I recommend for helping you set a vision. So for example, there are episodes that talks about CS for All's CS Visions framework, which is a fantastic way for kind of like figuring out what kind of direction you would like to head in. Are you going to focus on equity and social justice? Are you going to focus on coding as a literacy or computer science as a literacy? Are you going to focus on like future career readiness, etc.? There's no right or wrong way to use these different visions that they outline in that particular framework. So which one you use is kind of up to you and the other educators that you work with, as well as your community members. So I highly recommend listening to those particular podcast episodes to help you to figure out what direction you'd like to go into. And there are several different episodes in there. For example, there's an episode that talks about Kay Anders Ericsson's notion of deliberate practice and developing expertise over an extended period of time. This is often referred to as like the 10,000 hour rule, which is not actually a rule because the actual number depends on the domain, etc. But if you're trying to think about developing expertise in computer science from kindergarten all the way through 12th grade, that is going to be very different than focusing on just developing expertise over the course of a semester or a unit. So that particular episode kind of unpacks some things to consider when you are thinking long-term or short-term when you are developing computer science content. Another thing you can do with helping to set a vision is to join your local CSTA chapter. There's an episode with Jason Bohr that I highly recommend listening to that kind of talks about developing a community or joining a community. So for example, you could join a local CSTA chapter, or you could join CSTA National, which would allow you to connect on the virtual community, so you could post some questions to other CS educators who may be further along this path than you are. To be able to ask, okay, I'm thinking about heading in this direction with the vision. What other things should I consider or think about when developing a vision for our particular school, district, etc.? After you've listened to some of those episodes that kind of look interesting to you, I then highly recommend opening up the resources section under setting a vision and taking a look at the CS Visions framework. If you go through their little quiz on there, it will help you to figure out what direction you as an individual might want to head in. Now, if you are working on this from a district standpoint, if each person on the committee that's like going to start implementing computer science takes this CS Visions framework, it can lead to some interesting discussions because some of you might want to head in one direction while other people might want to head into a different direction. That's something that you'll want to reconcile and kind of like discuss in advance of actually developing a plan. Because if you don't know where you're going to go, you're going to get lost in the weeds, which there's actually been some scholarship that I've unpacked in other episodes that talk about that. After you as an individual or as a district or whatever have set a plan for where you would like to head with computer science education in your schools, community, etc., I then highly recommend actually sitting down and developing a plan, which is step 2 of this framework. When developing any kind of a plan, whether it's for your classroom or for your school or for your district, you need to think long-term and about worst-case scenarios. So for example, what is the current state of computer science in your class or in your district? In particular, if you're thinking from a district standpoint, I'd really recommend thinking about these strengths and challenges related to the district leadership, teacher capacity and development, technology infrastructure, materials, curriculum selection, and content refinement, community, and partners. Now, each one of these areas is actually unpacked in a workshop that is known as the Script Workshop. Kind of helps you think through the strengths and challenges in each one of those areas. I highly, highly recommend that districts actually go through the Script Workshop. It is available for free, at least it was last time that I checked. It helps you set the vision, which is the first step that I recommend, but it also analyzes your strengths and your challenges and helps you to set 3-month, 6-month, and even long-term goals in each of the areas that you would like to improve when you are implementing computer science in your district. It is the best way that I can recommend that you get started as a district, regardless of how big or small your district is and what kind of like form of implementation you want to go through. The Script Workshop is a fantastic way to develop a plan for implementing computer science in your district. And I do link to it under the resources section in section 2 called Develop a Plan. Now, some of the other questions that you might want to ask yourself is, will implementation be for those who want to sign up or mandated for all students? Regardless of which approach you end up taking, how will you make it more equitable and more accessible? Now, if it's for all students, will it be a standalone or an integrated class? Like in my district, it was mandated for all students, but it took over the technology class. So the technology class that like used to teach Microsoft Word, Office Suite, things like that, it instead switched over to, okay, every single kid who is taking this class, which is mandated K through 8, is going to instead focus 100% on learning how to program. That's actually the way that I highly recommend doing it, even though a lot of districts talk about integration. I've got many different podcast episodes that unpack some of the problems with integration, but to each their own. What might work well for the schools and the districts that I worked with might not work well for you. But if you are going to integrate it, then you need to consider what subjects you're going to integrate it with and how often you're actually going to set aside time for it. You also need to figure out what approach to integration you're going to use. And if you're unsure what I'm talking about here, listen to episode 123, which is titled The Subservient, Co-Equal, Effective, and Social Integration Styles and Their Implications for Computer Science. But again, there are several more episodes that unpack integration, so if you want to deep dive into that from somebody who's thought about this for several years, check out those episodes on integration. Now, going back to the episode that I mentioned previously, which was episode 66, titled The Role of Deliberate Practice in the Acquisition of Expert Performance, it's important for you to think of how are you going to develop expertise over an extended period of time? Is it going to be only for a month? Is it going to be for a year? Is it going to be for 13 years, kindergarten through 12th grade? Whatever approach you end up taking, you're going to want to consider how you're going to actually develop expertise in this literacy or domain over an extended period of time. You'll also want to consider what resources and funding do you have to get started and what do you need, as well as considering questions like how will you know if your implementation efforts are actually successful? How do you define success? What does it look like? And how will you document and communicate to various stakeholders the steps that you've taken, the direction that you're heading, and the challenges that you're currently working through to achieve the vision that you have created? And then the biggest one that you can ask as a district is, how will you know if it's sustainable? What's your backup plan if CS teachers in your school leave? What about if the lead of the program in your district leaves? Or there are just general changes in administration? Like you have a new superintendent and they're not a huge fan of computer science, but the current one is. Under section 2, Develop a Plan, there are several podcast episodes specifically for district administrators on how to get started with implementing computer science. There are several episodes that are specifically related to standards discussions and discussions on integration. And then there are resources that help guide administrators through this implementation process. Like CSTA has a document on guidance for K-12 administrators that I highly recommend taking a look at. But if you also want to see like a scope and sequence, like what does this look like in a district kindergarten through 12th grade? Like what kind of curricula and concepts will they work through? San Francisco has a K-12 scope and sequence that I've recommended for districts to take a look at. It gives you an idea of like, what does this look like over a 13-year period? Again, I linked to that one. But the number one thing that I recommend going through is the script framework for any district that wants to get started with implementing or developing a plan for implementing. All right, so after you've set a vision and you have worked on developing a plan for your classroom, your school, your district, etc., the third step that I recommend is reverse engineering computer science education. One of the things that I've noticed over the years is that a lot of professional development providers, especially computer science professional development providers, will walk you through a lesson plan as if you were a student. Then they might actually unpack what would you need to know to teach this particular lesson at the end of that. And if the content was actually created by somebody with a background in education, rather than just a team that has only a background in computer science, is the PD facilitator might unpack, well, what are the different pedagogies, philosophies, research, etc., that has kind of informed the approach that was modeled in that professional development session. This approach is very valuable for a lot of attendees because they are in a safe space where there is a knowledgeable expert who can kind of help teachers who might get stuck. However, if the curricular content is designed with enough detail, you can 100% go through the curriculum, the lesson plans on your own, either as a student or simply by reading through the lesson plans. And after going through enough of the content, you will learn not only computer science concepts and practices, but how to teach computer science. So if you want to actually learn computer science, I'd highly recommend taking this approach without actually forking over a bunch of money. The number one thing that I recommend when anyone is getting started with computer science is to start with something you're interested in rather than starting with something that somebody else thinks that you should learn. This could be something very broad. It could be like CS knowledge in general, or it could be very narrow tutorial on how to create something in a very specific language, platform, or particular project. After you've dipped your toes into content that you want to learn, I'd then recommend exploring content that you think your students would like to learn. So eventually you can learn how to teach it. Now, if you're unsure of where to start, you can check out the Roadmap for Professional Learning, which is linked in the resources section under the Reverse Engineering CS Education step in the show notes, which was developed by a team of people who are associated with CSTA. But another thing that you could do if you're unsure of what direction to head into is to, again, just ask your local chapter or even the virtual community for CSTA. Now, once you've figured out what you want to learn, you're then going to need to think through, well, how do you want to learn that? So you could take free courses online, you could watch YouTube videos, you could follow lesson plans as if you were a student, you could observe other people teach. Like I had several different district administrators and teachers come into my classrooms when I was still in the classroom to see, well, what does a typical day look like? You could audit a class at like your local university or community college. You could honestly read a manual or follow built-in tutorials for many different programming languages and platforms. You could look at code and read the comments or tinker with it, like by bonifying it. You could join discussion forums, read blogs, sign up for free university classes. Like in the show notes under the resources section, I include links to several different like programs from like Harvard, MIT, Stanford, etc., where they're literally giving away free computer science classes online so you can go through it at your own pace with zero cost to you. But whenever you're going through any of the content area, whatever form of media or medium you choose to participate in, I highly recommend looking at things from many different perspectives. So again, because there's more than 116 hours of podcast episodes for this podcast, and there's over 75 interviews that all provide unique different perspectives on computer science and computer science education, I highly recommend going through the older podcast episodes to kind of get some different perspectives on things that you might learn. And you can listen to the interviews, you can listen to the solo episodes where I unpack scholarship, etc. Now, the main downside for teaching yourself how to go through this is you don't have that expert in the room who can help you when you get stuck. So what I recommend if you get stuck is you could get a mentor from somebody else in your PLC, from your local CSTA chapter, from CSTA's community board, or even just by going on social media groups, or even like a hashtag on Twitter and asking for some advice or some help to be able to like work through whatever problem you've got. By collaboratively working through a problem or like some kind of a bug that you've got in your program, this is a very useful process for educators to work through because you're going to need to be able to model this with your students. This is something that several guests and myself have recommended on the show, is that you model debugging processes and like how you're working through problems in your programs in front of your students so that way you can help them to understand how they can do that themselves. So even though it can be frustrating getting stuck, like trying to figure out how to do something, if you do this with another teacher in your school or in your district, you can both kind of like work together to kind of figure out how to problem solve your way through this. You're going to eventually do this with students. Whether you want to or not, they're going to run into some kind of a bug where you're going to be like, I don't know how to do that. And then you're going to have to model how you would actually try and solve that. Now, if you have questions about pedagogy or some advice on how to implement, or if you're unsure how to approach a lesson or something like that, you can actually ask me a question in the YouTube comments for any of the podcast episodes that are on my YouTube channel, and I will likely answer that in a future episode. I've already done this a lot in my drumming streams, where people ask questions about technique, and I will model it in the stream, like, here's how you do this thing on the drums, etc. And I'm happy to do this for the podcast as well, so feel free to leave some comments on YouTube. Now, while you're going through whatever content you end up deciding to go through, I highly recommend reflecting regularly throughout that process. Note that if you were to actually read through computer science lesson plans from both the student and teacher's perspective to get a sense of how to teach computer science, this can be overwhelming for some educators to focus on both the new content knowledge and the pedagogical knowledge. So what I'll say for those of you who would prefer to just learn as a student, you can go through most course content to understand the actual concept, practices, skills, etc. related to computer science, and then reverse engineer the pedagogies after the fact, like after you've completed a project, a unit, a course, etc. So for example, you can use a framework called the unpack framework, and you can use this to think through after the fact, like, what was the technological knowledge that I learned in this particular lesson or would need to know to teach this lesson? What was the content knowledge I learned or would need to know to teach it? And then what's the pedagogical knowledge I need to know to be able to teach this lesson? So this, again, could be after you finished a project or a unit or whatever. And there's a link in the show notes to unpack if you want to read some more of the scholarship that's related to this and get some resources on it. But basically think of it as a Venn diagram between the technological, the pedagogical, and content knowledge to figure out like how they overlap and diverge from each other to figure out what things you need to be able to understand in order to teach a particular lesson for the classes that you're working with. Another thing that you consider when you're going through these resources is to reflect on the kinds of questions that you are coming up with or that you have, and whether or not you would know how to answer those questions if a student were to ask them. If not, perhaps you could explore them as new paths for your own learning or your own journey in computer science education. And under the podcast section in section 3, Reverse Engineering at CS Education, there are several episodes that talk about different questioning techniques and questions that you can ask your students that you're working with. So you can listen to that to kind of figure out some ideas of potential directions that you could head when working with students. And with some of those questions, you don't even need to know the answers to them. You can just kind of pose them to students and then help them guide them towards a direction that you might not know the actual solution toward. So listen to some of those episodes for more information on that. So after you've gone through step 1 of setting a vision, you've then developed a plan for step 2, and then for step 3, you are reverse engineering computer science education by acting as a student. Once you have gone through those 3 steps and spent some time, whether it's like a week or months, like kind of learning how to do computer science, you can then go to step 4, which is teaching computer science. You should have enough context now that you actually understand what you're talking about, and you're not just going to go and do it blindly. But I'd recommend starting small by teaching an introductory lesson on coding or computer science. Many educators start with unplugged activities because they are, quite frankly, most familiar to the teachers and less scary because you don't have to teach a specific programming language. However, if you started by actually going through the curriculum as a student, you can just jump straight into like programming right away on day 1 because you already have some context for it. This is what I actually recommend doing, and then taking the unplugged lessons and using that to support the other understandings rather than to introduce the understandings. And I talk about this in podcast episodes on situated language and learning, like the one with Brian Brown. But if we consider computer science to be like a language or literacy, then we need to spend time reading, writing, listening to, and speaking that language. If you don't do all of those things, then you'll have an incomplete or a decontextualized understanding of that domain, which is why I'd recommend that you not just focus on unplugged lessons. Yes, you can use them to supplement and enhance the learning, but really focus on contextualized learning or situated learning. Now, there are a ton of different ways that you can actually teach computer science, but my own personal preference is for interest-driven, project-based learning. You'll find a ton of episodes that are related to that, as well as episodes on how to make your teaching more accessible, more equitable, more inclusive. Now, I'm glossing over this particular section very quickly because there's over 190 episodes, many of which talk about equity, accessibility, inclusion, etc. So I'd highly recommend actually just listening to some of the previous podcast episodes to get a sense of how you might actually teach computer science education. In addition, in the show notes under the resources for section 4, Teach CS, I include frameworks like the Culturally Responsive Sustaining Computer Science Education Framework, inclusive teaching pedagogies, resources for virtual teaching, and then standards for computer science educators. All of those links include a ton of information that can help you with learning how to teach computer science education. After you have had some experience teaching computer science, I highly recommend the next step, which is step 5, reflect, refine, and share. When you're reflecting, think about what worked well and what could be improved for next time. This could be for an individual lesson, a project, a unit, a semester, a year, etc. Think about the things that went really well that you like to continue to do, and then think about the things that you might want to change or improve or enhance. In the show notes, there are multiple resources from CSTA on guidance for reflective teachers. There's a self-reflection checklist, etc. And then I know the Capeport Center is also working on some self-reflection resources as well that can help you to reflect after you've taught a lesson, project, unit, etc. Now, in the show notes, I also include a bunch of different podcasts to help you dive deeper into some of the concepts that you may have dabbled in when you were teaching computer science. There's always more to learn, so I'd highly recommend diving into the episodes that are listed there. As you continue your cycle of learning, implementing, reflecting, creating, and repeating that process, I highly recommend considering sharing some of the processes that you're working on by documenting the successes and failures. And you can do this through social media. You can do this at conferences like CSTA's conference. You can do it in a blog, in a publication for researchers or practitioners. You could do it in an online PLC, a school newsletter, staff meetings, etc. There are many ways that you can share what you're working on. This step in the process can help support other educators and maybe even improve their own understanding of both CS and CS education. Might even encourage them or motivate them to want to actually get started. Like the person who took over the classes that I used to teach in the K-8 district that I was in was an ELA teacher, and he got interested in computer science because I would share, here are the things that I'm working on with your students. And he's been teaching computer science ever since. So if you share your own experiences with computer science and computer science education, it might motivate some more people to actually join the field. Now, as you continue this cycle, you're going to refine your own understandings of both CS and how to teach CS. I would then highly recommend exploring new languages, platforms, curricular offerings, etc. to get more of a multi-perspectival approach and to make it so that students can head in different directions along different paths. So if you listen to the episodes on rhizomatic learning, we kind of unpack how if you have a classroom of 30 students, they could be working on 30 different projects, heading in 30 different directions simultaneously. So in my own classroom, we had the option of kids working with Scratch, which was one of the platforms that was block-based. They could use text-based with Ruby, which allowed them to code music in Sonic Pi. They could use JavaScript in Khan Academy, which allowed them to code some art and animation, or they could use Swift with Xcode, which would allow them to create like iPad apps and whatnot. With these 4 different platforms, students could head in any direction. They could focus on coding music, coding games, coding stories, all sorts of things that were of interest to them. I did not start with 4 languages and platforms on day 1. I started with 1. And eventually, like the next semester, added a second one, and then a third, and then a fourth. And I would have kept adding more if I was still in the classroom. If you want to learn more about how I design my classes, check out the episode on affinity spaces. Again, with over 116 hours of free content and over 190 episodes, I can confidently say that there are some topics that are going to be of interest to you. And if you go to the bottom of the show notes for this particular episode, I include a tag cloud of podcast episodes. The larger the word, the more podcast episodes there are on it. So if you click on one of the words like equity, there are 58 episodes that relate to equity, and there are 33 episodes that relate to integration, and there are many more topics listed on there, so check it out. You can find those show notes by clicking the link in the app that you're listening to this on, or by going to jaredoleary.com. If you found this or other resources useful, again, the only thing that I ask is that you share it either with an individual, or you can even share it on social media widely. It just helps spread the word about the free content that I create. And again, if you have questions, feel free to leave the questions in the YouTube comments. I'm happy to respond to them in an upcoming episode, or by simply replying to the comment itself. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Stay tuned for another episode next week. Until then, I hope you're all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.